Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my MSI Play-Ins Day 2 overview and analysis video. We are here to cover Group B today. We covered Group A yesterday, of course, on this channel, the first round of those games. You can check out that video up in the iCard. The playlist for MSI so far is going to be up in the iCard as well. That's going to include my primer, my big power rankings video for MSI, so if you haven't checked out that video, I highly recommend it. Of course, we go in depth on every team at the tournament, including the 4 that play today. So if you want to kind of get an idea of what I think of these teams going into these series, of course, we will very briefly touch upon all of them before we talk about the games that were actually played, talk about the expectations. But if you want a more in-depth breakdown of what I think of each player, of each team, check that video out. But today, we're going to be covering day number 2. And like we said, that's going to be the first round of Group B here in the play-in. So we're going to know the 2 teams that are in winners finals, the 2 teams that are in the lower part of the Group B bracket. And it's going to be interesting. If you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Who did you think was going to win these 2 series? I know Group B is probably the less interesting of the 2 sides, if only because, unlike Group A, where I think there are, like, maybe 3 teams that could make an argument that they are top 2 in the group, there's really, like, a clear top 2 in Group B, and it would be shocking if anybody else kind of broke their way through, but maybe there are some upsets. You know, we've seen some upsets in the past internationally. Maybe some of these minor regions can overperform our expectations. I'm excited to see, but of course, let me know what you thought down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we do on this channel is go game by game in the 2 best of 3 series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will quickly talk about day number 3 at the end of the episode, but most of today will be spent talking about day number 2 here of the play-in. So let's jump right into the analysis, shall we? Day 2 was definitely an intriguing one. We got to see our first glimpses of some of these teams internationally, and that kicked off with a pretty fun series matchup, at least on paper. 2 aggressive teams, the number 2 seed from the LEC in Fnatic taking on the number 1 seed from the VCS in GAM Esports. Of course, this is definitely a different matchup than it would have been like 3 months ago because of everything that's been going on in the VCS as of late. GAM was certainly not immune to the match-fixing scandal that essentially rocked the entirety of the Vietnamese League of Legends scene, but they were the ones who ended up coming out on top after all of that. They had to switch their roster up pretty dramatically for playoffs. They lost their carry duo, their mid laner, and their AD carry going into playoffs because of this match-fixing scandal, but luckily for them, they got to retain their 2 star players on the top side of the map in Kiaya and in Levi, who have just been, or Levi, sorry, I call him Levi, it's Levi, who have just been excellent for them over the last couple of years. In particular, Kiaya is somebody who I've raved about on this channel in the past. I think domestically he has proven that he is ridiculously talented. He's done well internationally before. Maybe he's never really broken out as that star from the VCS that maybe you would expect him to be with how dominant he is domestically, but still a player that I have a lot of confidence and faith in. And Levi, I think, has had one of his best years in a while so far. He's been given more responsibility, especially in the playoffs with the roster changes, and I think he's really lived up to that in a meta where jungle controls a lot. Like, the tempo of the game is almost entirely dictated by what your jungler wants to do. Levi, I think, has done a good job of being able to establish that for GAM. It's everybody else on the team that I'm concerned about. Emo, Easy Love, Elio, I just don't have a lot of faith in them. Elio's been on this team the whole year, and he hasn't been particularly good, even when they were a full group of 5. Emo's okay, but he's certainly not a star, and Easy Love, I have major question marks about, as I stated in that previous video, in the primer video. Watching his tape, it just didn't feel good. He was not good at all in the VCS, and so I don't really know how he's going to hold up internationally, but Fnatic is definitely a team that can both be incredibly difficult to deal with and also incredibly easy to deal with depending on which version of them shows up. They are one of the more dominant and difficult to take down teams from an advantageous position when they're winning at 10 or 15 minutes into the game. They do a great job of suffocating resources away from the enemy team and really pushing themselves forward. When they're losing, they actually play super bad from behind. That's always kind of been the MO on players like Razork and Humanoid, but that has not changed at all going into this year. If Razork and Humanoid are going to dominate the early game, if you're getting okay performances out of players like Oscar Rinnan and Noah and June, then I think they're going to be just fine. This shouldn't be a particularly close series. Even if you're not getting perfect games out of all 5 of these players, you should still be mega favorites. Again, we talked about it. This is a neutered GAM Esports team. This is a neutered team coming out of a minor region. This is not someone you should really be struggling with. There was an argument to be made that GAM was the worst team in the tournament coming into, you know, this stage of the tournament. So Fnatic definitely shouldn't have problems. If they do, that's going to be more concerning. But, you know, the only way we're going to know is to go game by game and to see what happens in this series. Of course, it's a best of 3, so game 1 is very important, and we get to start with game number 1. So let's go ahead and talk about it. The winner of game number 1 was Fnatic. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. Thank God they were able to win this. Not that it was ever really in doubt, but they certainly made some questionable macro decisions over the course of this game. I think they had a very clear idea of the aggression that they wanted to show, and it's kind of what we wanted to see. We wanted to see them come out with guns blazing, really keeping their foot on the gas and trying to make play after play after play. Some of those plays worked, some of those plays didn't. They gave up a Baron essentially for free because their macro just wasn't good enough to be able to respond fast enough to GAM sneaking it, but outside of that, they really didn't make any sort of major errors in this one. For GAM, it just feels like they are incredibly outclassed. There were a couple players on this team that played really horrible in game number 1 here, and I think there is an argument to be made that maybe we were overrating GAM coming into the tournament, because I think if Fnatic had played cleaner, this would have been a 20-minute like absolute rout. Like, this would have not been particularly close. It already wasn't particularly close, and that's with Fnatic kind of just doing their own thing for a lot of this game. And so GAM looking real bad in my opinion, and Fnatic looking pretty good. You know, I'm not going to criticize them too much. Player of the game in game 1 for me is pretty obviously going to go to Razork. He controlled the entirety of the early game, put so much attention, kind of shockingly, into the Ornn on the top side of the map. Him and Oscar were playing off each other for a majority of this early game. Not what you would expect from this draft, but I do like the idea of trying to take Kiaya out of the game. You know, he is kind of the focal point, the driving factor for GAM, really the only player that they can rely on to, you know, carry games against actually good competition. And so you take away the Twisted Fate, you make his life a lot more difficult by putting the Vi in top lane over and over and over again, and there's nobody else on this team that's going to be able to beat you. We'll talk about Kiaya in a second. He certainly made his own errors as this game continued to go on, but I think Razork being really aggro on the top side really was advantageous to Fnatic early, and obviously his team fighting in the back half of this game was excellent, consistently being able to get on Zeri. Vi really rose to prominence in the meta as a pick because of Zeri, and so, you know, not shocking to see that be a really effective way to continue to, you know, counterpick her. Easy Love we will also get to. Not all of it was Razork doing well. Part of it was just Easy Love gifting free kills to the Vi, which we will definitely talk about, but Razork did what he was supposed to do in this game. He established pressure early, and he really kept his foot on the gas. His team fighting was great. Humanoid was also excellent in this game. He is so good at Hui. We saw this throughout a lot of the beginning part of this year. He's just really, really good on this champion, and, you know, we talked about it in the meta report video that we did. Hui got buffed going into this tournament, and that's really not, I think, what a lot of people were expecting to see. He was already a good champion. I expected him to kind of rise into being one of the more staple meta picks because of the buffs, because I think the players who were playing him now just want to play him more, and Humanoid's definitely one of them. I don't really think you can give this away on B5. I think this is a pretty big mistake. I do like the idea of going for that Maokai plus Tristana kind of mid-jungle duo. I think that's good early on in a draft. It gives you a lot of consistency, but you do have to establish some sort of mid lane pressure to be able to do that, and Humanoid was too good to be able to do that, so credit to him. Oscar was very good in this game, especially early on. He did have that solo death, but it was a super close fight. You know, if Kiaya doesn't get that one more auto off in that fight, then Oscar probably wins it. But overall, Oscar was really good in this game, and it's a really encouraging sign to see him being able to step up and go toe-to-toe with someone like Kiaya. I ranked Kiaya higher than Oscar Rinnan going into this tournament in terms of top laners, and that very much did not play out here in game number 1. Noah and June were also fine. Wanted to see their laning phase be a bit better. Some of those trades in the 2v2 were actually not all that good from them. Elio did a good job of trying to push back the Xayah Rakan, but, you know, they got more stable, I think, as the game continued to go along. June in particular was a good playmaker, and Noah didn't really have to do all that much. So, you know, credit to Fnatic. They did what they were supposed to do, but it's Razork and Humanoid. Those are the two that you wanted to see step up, and they did here. And then for GAM on the other side, again, they're just not very good, or at least they showed that they weren't very good here in game number 1. Dud of the game could go to quite a few of these players. I'm going to give it to Easy Love, because truly, what was he doing in this game? It's one thing to not really do a lot of damage on Zeri when you're not in a particularly good spot as a team, because it's hard to make that engage happen. But it's another when you actually do have a lot of team fight angles and you're still outputting like very, very low damage in comparison to what you would expect coming out of that champion. Not to mention the fact that every single time this guy got Vi-ulted, he would dash out of his team, over the wall, away from everybody else. It's a point and click, buddy. He can't miss it at that point, and all of a sudden, he's alone with the super fed Vi, and he just instantly dies. It was a horrible game from Easy Love, and this just kind of backs up, I think, some of the, scouting that I did on him before this tournament, the tape that we saw in the VCS, he's just not a player that would be going to MSI if the VCS had not been riddled with, match-fixing suspensions. He's really just not all that good of an AD carry, and that definitely presented itself. Emo was also very outclassed, although I think his scoreline is a little bit worse than his individual plays. I don't think a lot of the Tristana mistakes were necessarily Emo's fault. I think some of it was just a bad game state, but he needed to be a lot more aggro in the early game if you're going to pick that Maokai-Tristana duo lane that was really successful at the end of the spring playoffs in especially the LPL. A lot of that comes from Tristana being able to win lane against basically anybody. If you are going neutral against Hwei, then all of a sudden that big positive that you get from that duo is not there anymore. Kiaya also just picked on over and over again, ended up being a bit more useful as the game continued to go along. He did get a solo kill on the top side of the map. He was more useful as a split pusher, but still not an ideal circumstance. And then Levi getting caught out multiple times after they get their Baron. I just don't understand. Like, you got to play a bit more coherent and cohesive than that. It didn't feel like this team was on the same page. And I think this just goes to show that GAM was actually given a lot of opportunities to potentially stay in this game. And I think a better team would have made this game a lot closer, but they're just not a good team right now. And they're going to have to fix stuff for game 2. But for Fnatic, you feel pretty good about game number 1. You want to clean a few things up, but all things considered, it really wasn't the worst game in the world. It's going to be interesting to see if they do play a bit better in game 2 now that they've gotten some of their kinks out of their system, but it's all going to be up to GAM. If they lose this, obviously they move down into the lower bracket and Fnatic moves into the upper bracket as expected. Can GAM keep this series alive, or is Fnatic going to take it in a 2-0 sweep? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to sweep this series 2-0, as was kind of expected going into this, and they're going to do it in incredibly dominant fashion. Honestly, looking at the stats of this game, I don't think you would necessarily get how dominant this game was from Fnatic. This was not close, really, at all. Really, the only times the GAM were able to get anything back in this game were when Fnatic was just overreaching for fun. And that's kind of the overarching story of this series, is that Fnatic really just kind of got to do whatever they wanted. They got to play really aggressive, they got to play really greedy, and they got to get away with it because GAM is just simply not good enough to even really perform at this tournament, at least in the current state that they are showing right here. These were the 2 worst games of the tournament by far up until this point. I know it's a small sample size, but man, they did not even look remotely competent in these games in this series. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole is going to go to Humanoid for me. He was obviously the focal point here in game number 2 on the Taliyah. Xin Zhao Taliyah is one of those like staple combos that we're seeing everywhere in the world, alongside the Maokai Trist, alongside Orianna plus insert team fighting jungler here. The Taliyah is, in my opinion, the strongest, most reliable pick in the current meta, at least of the ones that are getting through draft regularly. You're not seeing things like Varus get through as commonly, and so Taliyah ends up turning into the most valuable pick in the meta right now, and Humanoid certainly played it well. A couple of solo kills this game, really dominated the early laning phase, got a lot of love from not only like Razork and June in terms of the roams, but from Oscar Rinnan in terms of the lane swap roam. I think it was level 1 or level 2 or something like that. Oscar Rinnan just comes mid and picks up a kill. Really good stuff, I would say, from Fnatic to be able to capitalize on the lane swap meta. But Humanoid really was the star here. Yes, did he get himself into trouble at times in this game from being too far forward at 24 minutes when the game was already over? Yeah, but does that matter? No, he got so far ahead in the early game here. He was clearly the defining player of this game. He decimated Emo in this matchup. Clear choice for player of the game and clear choice for player of the series after that Hwei game in game 1 as well. For Razork, he was also excellent. He is the other player that I think you could give player of the series to because he was just really dominant across both of these games. I think the Vi game was a little bit more noticeable in terms of how he was taking over, but it's not like he didn't do a lot of good things on the Xin Zhao as well. Oscar was really good in this series. I was honestly a bit surprised with how well Oscar performed because Kiaya was someone I had a lot of confidence in coming into this series. It just didn't translate at all. The lane swaps, I think, really hurt him more than it hurt Oscar Rinnan. I'm not going to say that Fnatic was more prepared for this meta, but Kiaya certainly looked a bit more lost on the Cassante in both of these games. And, I think Kiaya's scoreline is worse than how he played. We will talk about that. Really, all of his deaths just came in front-to-back team fights where he's Cassante when the enemy team's super far ahead and he's going in and immediately dying, but Oscar was excellent in this series, constantly making good macro plays, really kind of controlling his own tempo. This is one of the better series that Oscar has played in a while, and that's definitely a good sign. Noah and June were by far the better bot lane. Easy Love is just not the kind of player that can play at this level, and so you're just looking at a lot of positives for Fnatic. If you are concerned about something when it comes to them, it's the fact that this really didn't feel like a test. This didn't really feel like, oh, well, if they can beat GAM so handily, then they should actually be pretty good for top esports. It doesn't really change my opinion on this team at all because GAM looked so bad that there really aren't a lot of takeaways for Fnatic that I think are going to translate into series against better teams, but at least they were able to come out here and dominate, and at least they were able to come out here and look really good. You wanted to see them just be the better team by a large margin, and that's exactly what they did. And then for GAM on the other side, again, like, there were positives to this team, I guess. Like, Levi was okay on the brand, but, like, what was he really supposed to do? He didn't have any protection in his own jungle, so he got invaded super early on in this game, and then was just kind of hoping and praying that Brand was going to have enough damage as the game continues to go along. I don't know what Brand plus Tristana is. Like, you have absolutely no safety in this team comp. Even with, like, a Vigar support, there's literally nothing here that is not super aggro and that can play from behind in any sort of way, and your team has already shown that they're not good at generating leads. So I don't get this draft in any way, but Levi was probably the only player that you could excuse. Elio was, I guess, generally fine, but everybody else in this team, not so good. Emo's a very clear choice for dead of the game. I don't want to go too hard on someone like Emo. The kid's 18 years old. He was just plucked out of academy and put right into a VCS championship winning team, having to play international. They just got here like a day ago. They clearly were not super ready to play because of all the visa delays that they had to go through. I'm not going to sit here and criticize Emo. This is a very tough situation to be dropped into, but I do have to be honest, like, he was horrible in this game. The Tristana has to win early. That's the whole point of the pick, and he got blasted in laning phase, and so there's really just not a lot of good things to talk about there. Easy Love continues to look very outclassed as well. Kiaya, like we said, didn't have a great game, even if he was, I guess, not as negatively impactful as maybe his scoreline would indicate. Overall, GAM just looks completely and utterly outclassed at every level of this tournament. Like, they are the worst team here, at least through the first series. Even a team like Astral going up against T1 showed a lot more, in my opinion. I think I am very concerned about what the VCS looks like right now, especially after all the match-fixing scandals. I imagine things will get better as the year continues to go along if teams have more time to not only, you know, scout players and bring in players that are going to be of a higher quality. They had like a 1-week turnaround on trying to find substitutes, but alternatively, just having more time for these players to play together and get used to finding a dynamic and finding a way to play as a unit. It just doesn't feel like GAM is there yet, and that's not entirely surprising. Again, they've had very little opportunity to be a team that can catch up to that, but this was a bad series. They're going down into lower bracket. They will face the loser of the series that we talk about next, but I don't think they're going to be favorited against either of the teams, obviously. You have a pretty good idea of who you're going to be facing on that lower side, but I don't think they're better than a team like Loud. Like, if Loud ends up going down there, they're not better than that. And so, you know, I'm very concerned that the VCS is just going to have a pretty poor year after all of the scandal. And then for Fnatic, good win, but again, how much do I really trust this team after this? It doesn't really change my opinion. GAM was more bad than I think Fnatic was good. Not that Fnatic was bad by any means. They took advantage of GAM, but GAM was so bad that I really don't know if I can have a lot of takeaways from this series. It's good that Fnatic was able to dominate it and was able to walk out with a pretty clean win, but I think the next series is definitely going to be their first real test. But that means we get to move on now to our second series here on day 2, our second series of the first part of Group B, and this one's just as interesting as the first, if not more so, especially with what GAM showed us. It's the number 2 seed from the LPL in Top Esports taking on the number 1 seed from the CB LOL in Loud. Loud have consistently been the best team to come out of Brazil over the past few years. They have been the representative multiple times for this region, but it is a bit of a different look for them coming in to MSI in 2024, most notably because their star player, really, in Seos in the support position is not there anymore. He went over to Kaboom, and they weren't able to qualify for MSI. They just weren't good enough across the board. Loud's more consistent roster, I think, kind of pushed them over the top, but I do actually think that the loss of Seos has hurt this team. I don't feel as good about Loud as I did in 2023. I was really high on them last year. I thought their playstyle was very electric. I thought that they were clearly the best team in the CB LOL, and it gave me a lot of confidence that they could do some fun things at international tournaments, and that's what they were. They were a fun team at both MSI and Worlds, just not good enough to really make like a huge mark. But this year I'm a little bit more concerned. They still have a lot of the good things going for them. They still are very aggressive, and they are going to push that tempo. They are going to try and outplay you in 1v1 or 2v2 or 3v3 skirmishes and situations. They're not afraid to try and take the fight to any team in the world, including, you know, one of the best teams in the LPL. But I don't know if they have the same kind of consistency that they had last year. I think that was really the concern with me watching them. They're going to rely a lot more on the top side of their map than they did in 2023, which I certainly think is something that is going to it's going to have to be monitored. Robo is a big carry for this team. He loves the Jax. A lot of times he can be kind of a Jax one trick. When he gets it, he can absolutely destroy games, but it's probably not going to be available for him for a lot of this tournament. Croc, I think, has done well this year. Tinone's definitely more of somebody who likes to play those shove and roamers. That's kind of his style on the team. And then Root has just kind of been there. I don't think he's a bad player. He carried a lot, especially when they were in big games last year, but I just haven't felt as good about the bot lane. Like, I'm definitely concerned that the bot lane is just going to be a bit of a problem for this team because I just don't really trust Redbird all that much going into a series like this. It was a big reason why I felt they were a tier down from a team like PSG, who I think is just more consistent across the board, but especially because you're looking at Top Esports on the other side of this matchup, and TES is a team that I'm a little bit higher on, I think, than consensus. I think that 369 right now has an argument to be made that he is the best top laner in the world, and I certainly would kind of make that argument. I put him at number 1 here at MSI for a reason. Jackie Love and Mako, I think, are being incredibly underrated by the global community. I see a lot of LCK fans saying that they're going to clearly be the 4th best bot lane at this tournament. I have them as the 2nd best bot lane at this tournament. I think they have proven to be able to play almost any style. Jackie Love is very versatile and a lot more, I guess, open to different things than people would give him credit for. Kind of the reputation he's gained over the course of his career. He's really expanded his champion pool and his playstyle pool, and Mako is really kind of the shot caller, macro leader for this team. He was arguably the best support in the LPL over the course of this year, so I really value this bot lane. If you have a concern for Top Esports, it's Tion and Cream as a mid-jungle duo, if only because this is Cream's first international tournament, and, you know, he's always been a bit more of an inconsistent player, but honestly, that narrative has switched a bit going into this year. He's actually been really good for Top Esports, not only on his traditional assassins and carries out of the mid lane that he was kind of known for in his early parts of his career on OMG, but he's been really good at the facilitators this year. This has maybe been the most complete year of his career as a starter, which I think is really good to see. And Tion, you know, he's been awesome for a lot of this year. I'm a Tion fan. I'm typically 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but that's more than a lot of other LPL fans are. On Tion, he gets a lot of blame for things that aren't necessarily his problem, but that 1 foot in, 1 foot out mentality is definitely going to track for a lot of his games. There are going to be some games that he takes over and just dominates. There are going to be some games that he kind of loses for his team, and so you never really know what you're going to get out of this jungle mid duo, but going into a team like Loud, that's still a positive matchup for Top Esports overall. This should not be a particularly difficult series for them. Loud's the kind of team that's going to be, in my opinion, interesting through the first 10 to 15 minutes of a game, but I don't know if they have the firepower to be able to close anything out against a team like TES that is just more clean and coherent than Loud, quite frankly. So I guess we'll see what happens in this series, but that means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Top Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0. Game 1, obviously, like we've said, matters a lot more here for the best of 3s than it does for the best of 5s, as we've talked about for a lot of this year, because it means that you only have to win 50% of the rest of this series, which definitely makes the process a little bit easier, all things considered, but this was a pretty close game. You know, when you take a look at the grand picture, you know, Loud did a good job of trying to keep up for a lot of the mid game here, and you can look at players like Tinones and Root. Please tell me in the comment section. I feel like I get this wrong every single year, but I'm going to call them Roots because I think that's correct. Tinones and Root were pretty good this game. Tinones in particular was creating a lot of action on a champion that I feel is very strong. Top Esports just was a lot more coherent in terms of the 5v5 team fights in the back half of the game, and this was kind of the scouting report going into a series like this, not only because it's Top Esports, but specifically because it's Loud. This is kind of the part of Loud that I would have expected going into a tournament like this. I would have expected them to be pretty coherent in the early game because they are talented. They know how to handle these 1v1s. They know their lane matchups. They're pretty good in isolated play. The problem is they just don't really feel like a cohesive team, especially the later on the game goes. We will talk about the disconnect that clearly happened in some of these fights between some of these players, but we talk about the winners first here on this channel, and that starts with Top Esports. Player of the game for me in game 1 is going to go to Cream in the mid lane. You know, Cream was one of the concerns going into this tournament because he just doesn't have any international experience. He's not somebody that I think a lot of people have a ton of expectation for, and so people didn't really know what they were going to get out of him. Was he going to be able to play that facilitative style that he was really good at the end of the year in the LPL, or was it going to revert back to kind of the more up and down version of Cream that we had seen when he was playing that style throughout the rest of his career on different teams? Well, this was a really good indicator that the Azir is legit. Now, his Azir has always been good, much better than people will give him credit for, but it was awesome in this game. He is a very clear choice for player of the game. The damage he was outputting in the back half of these fights, in the back half of this game, super consequential. Maybe you can give player of the game here to Jackie Love or even Mako or Tian or 369. I think everybody on Top Esports certainly played a lot of these back fights really well, but Cream was definitely the one I was noticing the most, and I think that's what kind of pushed him over the top for me. There were some moments where it's like, you could have used your ultimate maybe a little bit more proactively, or maybe that wasn't the best time to play a little bit safer. You know, there are micro things that I think you could pick out for Cream in this game, but for the most part, this was just a really well-played Azir game, and that's what you want to see out of him. If he's going to play competently, if you can be a primary late game carry for the team, if you're Cream, that opens up so many other opportunities for everybody else on this roster, because you know, Tian, 369, Jackie Love, if you can rely on Cream, all of a sudden they can play more aggro in the early game. And that does just make things easier. It does just make things more interesting for TES overall. So really like how Cream played, but you got to give credit to everybody. 369 was excellent in this game. I know that tanks don't always get the same kind of spotlight, and Cassante, not the most, you know, interesting champion in the world. He has a lot of tools. He can do a lot of things. It's not always the player. Sometimes it is the champion when it comes to Cassante, but 369, basically a premier tank game here. This is how you frontline for a team that is playing from either neutral or ahead. He was constantly in the right position. He was constantly taking good fights and putting his team in better spots because his engages were really good. He was prioritizing the correct targets. He was just awesome. Like, there really isn't a negative that I can give to 369. This was essentially a perfect game on the top side of the map. This was a #1 top laner in the world type of performance, even if he wasn't getting the same kind of resources that the rest of the team was getting. Jackie Love and Mako were great. Shout out Dracos. He said that Jackie Love wasn't known for his Senna. I don't know how much research he did on the LPL, but Senna was probably this team's best pick over the course of this year. Jackie Love's always been very good at Senna because he plays her super aggro and he can get away with it. He steps forward and really tries to deal a lot of damage, but Senna's one of the most forgiving champions on that front, not only because of her inherent kit, but because we often see her paired up with something like a Tahm Kench, and so Jackie Love can get away with some of the more risky things that he does on other champions and just kind of do them easier on Senna. There was a reason this team almost exclusively prioritized Senna when given the opportunity in the playoffs. This was B1 for Top Esports almost every single time they were on blue side throughout a lot of the playoffs. So not shocking to see it here. Mako's also really good at Tahm Kench. It gives him the opportunity to not only play as a support, but be what he's really good at, which is a big map effector. Move around the map, you know, really be in the spots that he needs to be. He can be a macro presence for this team as the primary shot caller, and I think that unlocks him a bit more. Tian got a lot of good resets in some of these fights, some really good mechanics on him on the Viego throughout this game, but generally I think they would have won it without the Viego as well. I just think Top Esports was really good down the stretch. I don't want that to take anything away from Loud, though. Loud did a good job in the early game of trying to fight fire with fire, trying to match whatever play that Top Esports wanted to go for, and, you know, actually get a lot of resources in some good situations. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. Tinones was really good in this game #1. Taliyah is going to be a big pick for Loud, I think, over the course of this tournament. Not only does it fit what they want to do in terms of how they want to enable jungle and how they want to enable bot lane and top lane and those lanes in particular, but also Taliyah's just ridiculously strong right now. She has refused to get nerfed over the past couple of patches, and I think that that is ridiculous, and Tinone's continuing to prove that Taliyah is very good here. Root was also very good down in the bot lane on the Varus. I still think Varus is the best AD carry in the game, certainly the most consistent. We saw a bit of that here. It just wasn't enough to overcome some of the 5v5 mishaps that this team had, and I talked about some of the cohesion issues that we saw. Redbert was kind of the main culprit of that. He's going to get dud of the game for me. I was worried about him going into a series like this. He, to me, was the weakness of Loud in the domestic league, in the CB LoL, when I went and watched playoffs, and it certainly didn't change here. I think some people are going to look at his aggressiveness and say, like, yeah, I love that he pulled the trigger every single time he had the opportunity to, but often what we saw is that Redbert would go in, he would have absolutely no follow-up, and would just die first in a fight, disconnected from the rest of his team. You can make plays work like what Redbert was doing. Like, it's not inherently wrong to be super aggressive and to try and, like, constantly throw your hook out in these fights and go deep and try to get on the backline if you're Nautilus. You can make that work, but your team has to be on the same page as you, and it just didn't feel like anybody was on the same page as that mindset decision making. This team desperately needed any sort of peel in the back half of this game, and you had Wukong and Nautilus both diving the backline, and I think it really hurt Loud's ability to fight, all things considered. Robo also was just not relevant at all on the Renekton. This champion's fine. He is still strong, but 369 just thoroughly outclassed him in the late game, and I think that that was definitely noticeable. I don't think Croc played particularly well. There are going to be some fights in the early game that people point to, but his team fighting on a team fight champion on R5 was really poor, in my opinion. So definitely some things that need to be worked on for Loud, but again, this early game aggression, this is what we expected to see from this team. We know they can go toe-to-toe in terms of some of the mechanics. They just need to clean up their ability to translate a neutral game into something that could be more positive for them moving forward, but they're going to have to do it now because we're moving into, you know, game number 2 of a best of 3. If they lose this, they move down into lower bracket. If Top Esports win this, they move on to winners finals to take on Fnatic. Are we going to get 2-2-0s today, or are we going to get a game 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Top Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series in a 2-0 sweep, 2-2-0s today in the group. Not entirely surprising. Both teams should have won their games, but it certainly sets up an interesting winners finals that we'll talk about a bit at the end of the episode. But here, game 2, very similar story in my opinion to what we saw in game number 1. Loud is going to be taking it to Top Esports. You're going to have moments where, you know, Root actually has a lot of gold in the early game. He's like 4-0 at 15 or 20 minutes or whatever it was, and you have Tinones that's slowly scaling up here on the Aurelion Soul, and the Zac is going to be useful in team fights essentially no matter what, but none of that matters because the difference between these two teams, yes, there is like a mechanical difference, but it's not nearly as big as you would expect between an LPL team and a minor region team. The difference is macro, and that's exactly what we saw here, is that Top Esports macro was just immaculate, essentially, and they were just constantly first to everything. They were constantly ahead of the curve when it came to where they needed to be in. Loud was just never going to be in this game because of that. Even from a neutral state, if you're Loud and you're playing from neutral in this game, you're playing from behind, just because Top Esports is going to be able to just do things a little bit cleaner than you are, and that's just what we saw throughout this game. No flame to Loud. They did their best to make this series interesting, and especially coming off of that Fnatic GAM series, GAM was a complete pushover. Loud was not a pushover. They tried their best, but this was just never a team that was going to be able to compete with a team like Top Esports with the way that they play the game. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game and player of the series is going to go to JackeyLove. This was an absolute no-brainer for me. I saw a lot of people in the kind of pre-MSI coverage really talking up other bot lanes and, you know, kind of putting JackeyLove and Mako fourth and just being like, they're whatever, right? Like, they're just okay. I think people forget who JackeyLove is. I think it's been too long since we've seen JackeyLove dominate on an international level, and I think people just have genuinely forgotten that JackeyLove is him. Like, he is that guy. He is that dude. He was the MVP of the LPL for me last year in the spring split, or the summer split, even though his team didn't make Worlds. That's how good I thought he was. He was dragging this Top Esports team across the finish line, and Mako came in and was excellent with him. This bot lane is legit, and JackeyLove popped off in this game. Kalista is still very strong. I know she hasn't had the best performances at MSI so far, but I think that has more to do with the teams and the style of the teams that have been picking Kalista. Like, PSG was picking Kalista. That's just not a pick that I think really works for what PSG wants to do. Top Esports loves something like Kalista. It allows Jackie to really snowball the game out of control, and he's still going to be very useful on that champ in the late game because his individual mechanics and his positioning are just so good, and we really saw the takeover performance that he could put out. JackeyLove is going to be a star at this tournament, and honestly, maybe I'm calling my shot too early, but I think people are going to be walking out of this tournament instead of being like, oh, you know, Top Esports was just that team that got sent out of the LPL as number 2, but remembering just how freaking good JackeyLove is. That will be the takeaway from Top Esports at this tournament. I guess I'm calling my shot, but really, is that even a shock? Mako was also excellent here on the Renata. That ultimate is just very good, but his laning is excellent. He's really improved in that stage of the game. It was something he wasn't always like the best at. He was one of the best supports, but a lot of that was due to it being like roaming metas in 2020 and 2021 when he won Worlds. Like, that was kind of the MO for Mako, but his laning improved so much over the course of this year that he's become one of the better support laners in the world. You can make a strong argument that Mako is the best support in the world right now. I think that he's in that conversation. 369 was excellent. Deathless on Ornn, a couple of really big ultimates. Cream continued to be really good on the Azir, even if he didn't need to carry this game in the same way that he did in game 1. And Tian was constantly diving. I mean, credit to him. He knew he had the Renata E to stay alive in some of these fights, so he was going super aggro to set up the rest of the team. He was the one who often took the fall in some of these fights, but for the most part, it was entirely worth it. Top Esports was just ahead of everything. Again, I can't stress enough, their macro was so excellent in this game, and That's always going to be an advantage that a Mako-led team has, a 369-led team has, is they are macro geniuses, and you really see it come out against a team like Loud. But again, I don't want to disparage Loud. I don't want it to come across like I'm not saying they did well. They did the best that they possibly could. This was a team that really went toe-to-toe for a little while. You had an Aurelion Soul scaling. You had gold on your ADC. You just didn't really have enough setup pieces, and again, your macro just wasn't quite good enough to be able to secure that advantage. So you're not going to be walking out of this feeling great because you lost 0-2, but you're not going to walk out of this feeling horrible. I think you definitely, gave a good effort of it. I don't love this draft. I do like the idea of this draft, but first of all, I'm out on Zac Top. I talked about the nerfs and how I think that actually affects him. I really don't think it's that good in lane, and we saw that really wasn't able to accomplish any of the, skirmishing things that they needed to do pre-10 minutes over a lot of the, neutrals that were on the map. I think Zac was just weaker in those circumstances than he would have been a little while ago. He's still going to be Zac in team fights. It doesn't necessarily matter as much, but the effects of laning take more of a toll on him as opposed to like his stats just generally being worse if he's allowed to set up. So you have these skirmishes that end up being a bit more of a problem, but I don't think Robo was the issue. Tinones and Root were not the issue in this game. The Aurelion Soul was doing a lot of damage, was scaling. Root did a good job of capitalizing in some of these fights, but the setup just wasn't there. Redbird's going to get my dud of the game once again. It's just staggering how many times he throws out a hook when he has absolutely no business throwing out a hook. It really does feel like he is just disconnected from the rest of this team in terms of when they want to go in and when they want to play aggressive. He plays to his own tempo, and the rest of the team is just not there to back it up a lot of the times, and it really, really hurts Loud. And Croc had a bad game. I think the scoreline's a bit worse than maybe what Croc did. His early to mid game was okay. He was finding picks, finding catches to get the Varus ahead. It just couldn't sustain it. In some of those late team fights, the Poppy was genuinely just kind of useless, which is never really an ideal situation to find yourself in. For Loud, you're going to be moving down into the lower bracket, but I guess the positive spin on this is you're now taking on GAM, who is super beatable, as we saw earlier on in this video. Like, they should absolutely be favorites, especially with what they showed here against Top Esports, but this was just a little bit above their pay grade. And then for TES, they now take on Fnatic. We'll talk about that a bit because that's happening tomorrow. I'm very excited to see if they can, cleanly get their way through that series. They're going to be favorites for that series as well, so definitely going to be interesting to see if they can take care of business on that front. I think they showed a lot of good things here today. Their mechanics are really solid, but their macro was really, really excellent, and if that's going to be the case, this is going to be one of the more dangerous teams at the tournament, like I predicted. Alright, but that is going to do it for my MSI Play-Ins Day 2 overview and analysis video. We now know the 4 teams that are in the winners finals, if you will, the 4 teams that are in the lower sides of their group. We're going to have winners finals of both sides of the bracket tomorrow. It's T1 and FlyQuest and Top Esports taking on Fnatic on Day 3. The expectation is that the Eastern teams are going to get out. T1 and Top Esports are favorites in both of these series, and I'm certainly not going to disagree, but, FlyQuest and Fnatic aren't horrible teams. Hopefully they can at least take one game. I don't want to see 2-2-0s tomorrow. That would be a bit boring, but I would love to know your thoughts and opinions on everything that's happening at MSI down in the comment section below. Do you agree with my analysis or do you not? I don't know if you're going to agree with everything I said in this series. Would love to know your thoughts on everything down below. Of course, if you did enjoy the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the MSI every single day on this channel. Every single day of games is going to be covered, so hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified daily when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.